Okay, official beginning. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Dana Ripper. With me here from the Missouri River Bird Observatory is Ethan Duke. Our mission as an organization is conservation via science, education, and advocacy. We study birds and their habitats in Missouri's most imperiled ecosystems. We engage hundreds and thousands of people each year with education events and advocate for science-based conservation policies at the local, state, and national levels. We are here in our 2025 Winter Learning Series, where we have all of these webinar topics are about things that have direct effects on the conservation of birds and other wildlife, as well as a pretty much perfect overlap with human health and well-being as well. If you'd like more of an intro to MRBO itself, if this is your first time joining us, you can check out the YouTube on our YouTube channel of the very first webinar, which was on January 6th, or just check out our website, mrbo.org. We hope that this series of webinars will help you become more aware, more involved, and more inspired to take action, both for conservation and to welcome, as we're going to talk about tonight, all people from everywhere and all walks of life into our love of nature and our conservation movement. So I am really psyched to invite our speaker tonight, Sebastian Moreno. He's a PhD candidate in environmental conservation at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Sebastian's work focuses on making science and nature more accessible, contributing to the conservation of our natural environment in an increasingly urbanized world. Sebastian's master's thesis at the University of Missouri explored the ecology of urban vacant lots in targeted St. Louis neighborhoods that were shaped by systemic racism. His research highlighted the habitat value these spaces add to the urban green space matrix and revealed how many residents there felt disconnected from nature. These conversations sparked his passion for bridging gaps between people and the environment, particularly in urban settings. As a PhD candidate, Sebastian integrates his urban ecology and ornithology expertise with his commitment to engaging communities. His research investigates the attitudes and motivations of participants in citizen science programs, aiming to empower individuals to advocate for themselves and their communities. By fostering opportunities for citizen science and increasing access to environmental information, Sebastian seeks to inspire greater participation in conservation efforts. Beyond his academic work, Sebastian actively engages with the public as a volunteer for the Western Massachusetts chapter of Latino Outdoors. He also serves as a biological intern with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Office in the Office of Conservation Investment, which funds and supports conservation through grants that promote fish and wildlife health, habitat restoration, clean water, imperiled and endangered species conservation, and outdoor recreational access. So, Sebastian, we welcome you. I'm super excited. I've seen your presentation once, and I know it's going to be amazing. So,
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. I'm trying not to look at the number as it keeps going up, but I think this is the biggest virtual crowd I've ever spoken to. So no pressure. All right. Can everyone
that's
see
great.
everything? Perfect. Thank you. All right. So yeah, thank you for that presentation. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for this platform. Missouri as a whole has a place in my heart as someone who went to the University of Missouri. My partner is from St. Louis, best friend lives in Missouri. So there's a lot of love in Missouri. So I felt like this was a great platform to talk about my work and talk about my relationship with nature and how it developed throughout the years, my research, and kind of what I've seen as a person of color in conservation and as a person of color coming into the world of nature where some other folks may have grown up with a significantly different relationship. So with that being said, I'd like to establish a mutual understanding before we move on any further and agreement regarding our discussion today. So while I bring my own experiences and insights to this space, I do not represent all historically marginalized communities. Each person's experiences and perspectives are unique and diverse. My lived experiences shape my reflections and insights, and while I aim to highlight shared experiences and common themes, I recognize that I cannot capture the full range of experiences in this discussion. I also understand that these conversations can sometimes evoke discomfort or unease. And I really encourage us to embrace that discomfort as a source of growth and learning. This is a safe space where everyone's voice is valued and respected. If someone expresses a viewpoint at any point that seems unfamiliar or possibly insensitive, let's go ahead and approach that with compassion and curiosity rather than judgment. These moments offer opportunities for mutual understanding, education, and personal growth. So by participating in these discussions, we are committing to create a supportive environment where we can engage meaningfully, challenge assumptions, and broaden our perspectives together. So with that, I hope that everyone can keep that in mind as we move forward. And honestly, with that out of the way, I also want to introduce you all to my parents. This photo was taken back now in 2018 when I graduated from Mizzou with my master's. My parents, they're one of my biggest supporters, so I feel necessary that this story starts with them before I talk about me. Um, my parents immigrated to New York City from Colombia in South America in the 80s when they were just teenagers. While my dad is equally as important to me and my development, for the sake of this conversation, we're just going to focus on my mom. Um, so this is my mom's hometown, Pereira, Colombia. In the summer of 2022, I had the privilege of visiting Pereira to reconnect with family and connect to where my mom grew up. Pereira is Colombia's 14th most populous city, and it's surrounded by mountains, farmland, and forest. A lot of birders that I know have visited Pereira on their birding trips to cross off a couple of lifers from their list. It probably takes roughly 30 minutes to drive in and out of the city. Once you're out of the city, you're greeted by just beautiful, beautiful nature. We visited thermal pools not too far out from the city. And when I tell you, it was one of the coolest experiences of my life. We were in winding roads going, between mountains covered in just dense, lush forest, waterfalls that started from like top of mountains and just kept falling into like a tree covered landscape. They almost disappeared halfway down. It felt like Jurassic Park in a sense. Um, Truly, truly beautiful. I myself got a couple of lifers while on this trip. But this is where I grew up. I grew up in New York City in the borough of Queens. And like many large US metros, it's just buildings on top of buildings surrounded by concrete. And just like any large metro, driving 30 minutes in any direction won't get you too far. I think, driving 30 minutes in Queens, if I'm lucky, I'm probably reaching the border of Queens and maybe entering a new borough if I'm lucky. Um, while I lived in New York City, I wasn't really hearing this place being a destination for birding or even a destination for just engaging with nature. In fact, I can guarantee that a majority of folks don't think about a large metro area as a destination for connecting with nature. So because of that, growing up, I had this preconceived notion that there was no nature around me. As an adult reflecting on my childhood, I now recognize the definition of nature that I had was, an area where no humans lived and where animals just roamed freely. So I was just thinking of like Sahara desert, like Sahara, Serengetis, just these remote areas. So because I didn't believe I had access to nature, I spent a lot of time connecting to nature through TV. And my go-to channels back in the day were the Discovery Channel, Animal Planet, and National Geographic. And these were the people that I grew up watching on TV. I thought they were the coolest people with the greatest job on the planet. Jeff Corwin and Steve Irwin would travel all around the world, getting up close and personal with all these types of wildlife. Steve, may he rest in peace, was also just insane and would just jump into murky waters. He would disappear for what felt like an eternity and then just like reemerge from the water with just a croc, like it was some sort of like puppy or kitten, just all cute. And the Crap Brothers up top having this talking lemur was like the coolest thing to exist. You can imagine my surprise when I learned that the talking lemur was actually a puppet. But as I reflect on what influenced my career choices, I really don't think I could give any of these amazing people any credit. When I was 10 years old, I really probably couldn't tell you why, but now that I'm 30 something, I think I've been able to articulate those words and put them together. And it's simply because I didn't see myself in them. Besides our love for wildlife, we really didn't have a whole lot in the relatability department. So that was just that for me. Um, when I was like in sixth grade, we moved out of New York City to the Delaware Water Gap in Northeast Pennsylvania. This region is more commonly known to folks as the Poconos. So this picture here is maybe 15 or so minutes from where my parents live. Growing up, I jokingly called this place the 100-Acre Woods, and if you wander long enough, you could find Christopher Robin, Winnie the Pooh, and all their friends. But realistically speaking, this 100-acre woods is more like 66,000 acres of woods. Honestly, the complete opposite of New York City. In the Poconos, I was getting up close and personal views of foxes, bears, possums, raccoons, deer, coyote, and birds that just weren't pigeons or house sparrows. And you may be thinking that after moving from a densely populated and predominantly impervious area to the 66,000-acre woods, my disconnection from nature would have been resolved. And that's the end of the presentation. But unfortunately, it wasn't like that. Even to this day, when I go outside, there's this voice on the very back of my head that's like warning me with all the dangers that exist in the natural world. And that voice comes in the shape of my mother. Um, My mom has been warning me about the dangers of the outdoors ever since we moved out of the city. Now, remember, this is a woman that grew up in New York City in the 80s. So, whenever I told her I was going on a hike or doing some sort of outdoor activity, whether it was down the street from where we lived or, halfway across the country, I usually heard one or a combination of these things. I would hear my mom say, yeah, that sounds dangerous. I can't believe you're going out there. It's so remote. It's so lonely. I would show her pictures of where I was gonna go and like, yeah, mom, check this out. Look at the views. Look at the scenery. And she's like, oh yeah, it's really pretty, but I bet it's scary. She would be like, what? Seriously? No way, not me. I wouldn't go out there even if you paid me. She always had this fear of a stranger jumping out of a bush. Like there was always someone stalking me and just waiting for the perfect opportunity to jump. So she'd be like, what if a crazy person jumps out and it hurts you, attacks you, kidnaps you, worse? Um, and then it didn't matter what time of the year or where in that country I was. I was always going to get eaten by a bear. She'd be like, be careful, there's a bear, it's going to come out. I think the bear and the crazy guy in the bush were just in cahoots the whole time. So with my mom's concerns with the unseen dangers of nature and seeing the lack of representation in TV growing up, and through honestly my travels as I got older, I kind of started developing these two thoughts. One, the outdoors may be trying to kill me, and I really am ignorant and have no idea it's happening. And two, the outdoors may just be a space for white people. In fact, for a very, very long time, I chose not to participate in several outdoor recreational activities because I stereotyped them as white people stuff. So, imagine having that mindset that the natural world that is for everyone and certain outdoor activities were actually not for everyone and just for certain groups of people to enjoy. That's how I started feeling. So fortunately, I had people that were encouraging and willing to facilitate my curiosities in nature. Living in this 66,000-acre woods, my high school friends were always up to go hiking or just spend time outdoors. On hot summer days, we would go off trail and look for streams to cool off and sometimes take naps like I am right now. We would also take our kayaks on the Delaware River and find little islands during low tide and roast hot dogs over campfires. So because of those high school friends, I built the confidence to go out and explore the local trails and waterfalls in our area. In undergrad, I was around people who gave me the confidence to spend a few days in the Amazon rainforest. And in that same trip, I had some time in the Galapagos Islands. This was an amazing experience that ended with me and another close friend of mine having our undergrad graduation ceremony on the beach after a long day of snorkeling in the ocean looking for wildlife. that I had only seen in TV. And then just to add the cherry on top of this amazing brag, I also had the opportunity to swim with some equatorial penguins that were just out in the wild. So truly a life-changing experience for me. And my time in Missouri, when I, started actively planning trips around the United States, going to national parks with friends, I would just, call friends that I hadn't seen in a while or hung out in a long time. And I'm like, hey guys, I'm going to X national park in Y state. Are you interested? Do you want to come? And, throughout grad school, I had these amazing opportunities to participate in prescribed burns. I started handling all type of wildlife, and I was actually starting to feel like Jeff Corwin and Steve Irwin holding this snapping turtle as if it were like a cuddling puppy. And this picture, till this day, scares the living daylights out of my mom. And this person is actually in this Zoom room right now, but Zach, a phenomenal friend, taught me everything I know about hunting. Even when I would tell my mom where I was going, who I was going with, I did everything by the books in terms of hunting safety. I always got the same response. It was guns kill people. This is so scary. I can't believe you're doing this. What if you get hurt or worse? And fortunately, none of that ever happened. And that's because I had Zach on my side and other friends who taught me proper gun and hunting safety. And throughout the years, Zach took me duck hunting, pheasant hunting, dove hunting, and it was truly a transformative experience. I learned to be grateful for my food and understand conservation from a hunting perspective. I even became a supporter of Quail Forever, a nonprofit that works to conserve quail, pheasants, and other wildlife through habitat improvements, public access, and education, and conservation advocacy. To this day, I make my contribution to the organization because I really believe in the work that they're doing. And I even buy my annual federal duck stamp, regardless if I go hunting that season or not. So on top of getting involved in hunting with a firearm, I also started hunting with a bird of prey as a licensed falconer. So nowadays, and through all these experiences, it's really shaped me to the person that I am today. And if it wasn't for any of these folks, I don't know if I would be here with you all today talking about these things. So because of that, I'm getting my PhD in environmental conservation, where I study how to make citizen science more inclusive for the sake of bird conservation. I'm an intern for the Fish and Wildlife Service, where I work with grant biologists, ensuring that funds go to states so they can turn that money into habitat improvements, wildlife conservation. And I'm a volunteer for Latino Outdoors, an affinity group that works on creating safe spaces for Latino identifying folks and our allies to just explore and connect with nature and the outdoors. So I'm going to now go on a little bit of a hard direction change and talk a little bit of my research and what I do, and citizen science and the importance of engaging the public in the scientific method, whether it's as educators, as conservationists, as scientists. It's just really important that we reach out our network as much as possible. So for starters, when we engage the public in the scientific method, we are actually encouraging folks to actively think about science in relation to their daily lives. And it also strengthens that relationship between, conservationists, scientists, policymakers, and the public. As a scientist, I will admit, I don't always do the greatest of job of making science accessible and easy to understand. We as scientists typically have really good intentions, but sometimes don't get our message across effectively, or we just don't trust the public for some bizarre reason. And because of that, the public doesn't trust us. And if we want the public to trust us, then we need to show them how the scientific process works. Show them that being a scientist means being wrong every single time and going back to the drawing board with the data that we collected and new information that we have and trying to get a more correct answer. Not the right answer, a more correct answer. Because when we don't foster that relationship, we get the public discourse that kind of looks like this. I've heard things like, I thought scientists said that we should do X and now they want us to do Y. I don't get it. I heard from a friend's cousin's uncle's dog's sister that we're supposed to be doing blah, blah, blah. I've also heard people that you should do your own research. These scientists are feeding you lies. I've also heard things that, I read this article and, this is what I learned, when in reality, that article was a Facebook post and there's zero integrity to that. I've also heard that scientists don't know what they're talking about. And again, these are all very, very valid ways for people to react when we as scientists are not giving them enough information and we just want them to trust us. So one way that we as scientists, as conservationists, as educators can connect to the public in the scientific process is through citizen science. So I know citizen science can sometimes be a pretty daunting word. It could have, some negatively charged meanings to it. So I kind of want to break down the language and how I use it in my research. And maybe you can also take that with you and share it with your friends. So citizen science is simply an umbrella term that is used to describe three forms of engaging the public in scientific research based on the level of the public's engagement. So the lowest end of the public engagement is typically known as contributory science or just crowdsourcing science. Here, the research question, the design, the protocols are all created by the scientist. These programs typically cover large geographic regions over a long period of time. Up next is collaborative science. So you can start seeing how these words kind of give a little bit of that description, sometimes known as collaboration science. So like contributory science, the science, the question, and the design of the protocol still come from the scientist. However, the public has a little bit more options when it comes to engaging with the research. So maybe just collecting that data, the public now can analyze the data as well and help in distributing the findings through flyers, public presentations, forums, scientific conferences, etc. And then finally, we have co-created, or what most folks commonly known as community science. This type of research has the highest level of public engagement. So at this point, we've completely tipped the scales. So here, the public is actually producing the question, and they're using their connections with scientists from nonprofits, government agencies, and universities to see that their project is completed. These projects are typically very, very small due to the intent of the project and also don't last too long. And my work mostly focuses on contributory science. So benefits of participating in citizen science as a participant. Some that I've noticed in my own work is there's a huge increase of individual sense of place and where they belong. There's an increase in the individual scientific literacy. I was talking earlier to Dana and Ethan about, sometimes we as conservationists, scientists, nature enthusiasts, we take a lot of words for granted. Something as simple as diversity is a word that we think everyone knows, but, people may not know what diversity means. So getting those words into people's vernacular is incredibly important. We also are strengthening skills and knowledge. Some of these skills in citizen science programs are actually transferable, and that can be used for other scientific endeavors or even for just jobs. And finally, we have an increase in an individual's sense of conservation and stewardship. There's a huge increase in their efficacy when it comes to that stuff. But it's not all about the participants and the citizen scientists. There's also huge benefits for the scientists as well, me. For starters, as someone who studies how birds use people's backyards, I honestly can't think of how I would even go about studying this if it weren't for my participants granting me access to their backyard. So because of citizen science, I've gained access to private lands that makes what I do possible. The amount that I've collected in a limited amount of time has gone up significantly. The amount of data that I have because of my participants is just out of this world. When I first started inputting my data for my research, I think I made about 4,000 observations in the span of maybe 2 years, whereas my participants in those same 2 years made 8,000 observations. So because of that, the pressure and time spent collecting data went down. Like I said, it took me 2 years to collect 4,000 observations. And if I had done all of this on my own, it would have taken me 4 years to collect those 8,000 observations that my participants made. So then, doing some math there, that's about 6 years just to collect data. So while I love my program and I love my PhD, 6 years to collect data for just one chapter just does not seem as attractive as it may seem. I would like to finish this degree some point in this lifetime. Um, but lastly, because of my participants, my sense of place has gone up. Because I'm not from Massachusetts. I was not from Missouri. So I came to this program here as a complete outsider. I learned a lot from my participants, and they helped me tap into various communities in Western Massachusetts. Many of my participants have, turned into friends. I've ran into participants at the local quilt show. I've exchanged information about orchids and plants that we have in common. I go birding with them, and some I meet regularly to play card games. So it's been a huge benefit for me to be around these citizen scientists. So what is the problem when we think about citizen science, particularly when we talk about avian-based contributory science programs? Well, participants are typically, when we look at them, white, affluent, retired folks that live in the rural suburban spectrum of our world. And while there's absolutely nothing wrong with this demographic participating in such programs, we do have to examine the data that is being collected, as well as the data that isn't being collected. So in 2022, Dr. Aaron Grade, a former UMass graduate student and lab mate of mine, looked at census tract data for Boston and Phoenix. He was specifically interested in the percent of the population in these two cities that identified as white, as well as the median household income. In these maps, I know it's a little overwhelming, but the darker the shade of blue is, the higher the percentage of folks that identified as white on the left, and similar for the median income. The darker the blue, the higher the median income. So Aaron then compared these two census tract data with completed eBird checklist. Again, the darker the blue, the more checklists were submitted. So here we go, and I will just highlight for you up top Boston, down low Phoenix, the areas with the highest completed checklist. Now, if we look at what that looks like in comparison to demographics and money, we can start seeing a little bit of correlation. And that's, not a surprise. But that is a bit of a problem because skewed participation could lead to data collection. And if we are using a lot of citizen science data, eBird data, to inform our conservation decisions, that could be a problem. With 80% of the US population living in the urban and suburban areas, we scientists are really engaging those who live in the rural suburban portion of this gradient. And yeah, that's a concern because, again, if this is the data we're using to make policies, then our conservation decisions right out the gate might not be as accurate as we're hoping. And that's honestly because we can't address conservation without addressing these systemic issues. If we want to be more inclusive with the natural world, then we also have to acknowledge the systemic issues in our country that are correlated with conservation issues. So, unfortunately, many people in positions of power can say some inaccurate and insensitive things. Here are a few things I have heard personally in various spaces that I've participated that have lingered with me a little bit that I just want to share with you all. So I've heard, why don't they accept our help? We're doing them a favor, and I just don't get it. I've also heard things along the lines of, no one came to this event, no one came to this meeting, so I guess people really aren't interested in this. I've also heard, what are some low-hanging fruits we can reach to diversify these spaces? For me, I hear, what's the least we can do in effort so we can get a couple of people of color involved in these spaces? I've also heard Unfortunately, the program ended due to lack of participation. Funding could not be justified. It was it just had to be pulled, and we had to allot that money to something else. And while these statements necessarily are not coming from a place of hate or wanting to cause harm, these statements do come from a place of ignorance. And in 2016, a study with USGS and North Carolina State University and the Fish and Wildlife. They actually surveyed outdoor recreationists in urban areas and folks that are attendants to urban wildlife refuges. And these were actually the barriers that people faced. So there was a fundamental barrier to participation was a lack of connection to nature. Some of these reasons included being surrounded by concrete and constructed environments. There was a lot of distraction with technology and electronics, particularly with children. They may spend a lot of time indoors and in front of a screen, maybe looking at nature through TV. And a lack of interest or an exposure to nature that stems from, cultural or socioeconomic factors. Many also express concerns for safety and comfort and describe the outdoors and recreation as scary or unapproachable. If people aren't familiar with being outdoors, they may fear the unknown or be reluctant to try something new. People also may have more specific fears about the outdoors and what they may encounter, like someone hiding in a bush or a bear that may attack them. Um, People of color also felt like they lacked cultural confidence in many outdoor spaces. Participants described how white people in the United States have a cultural confidence and are more comfortable in new and unfamiliar situations. Minority groups, on the other hand, are often uncomfortable and in unfamiliar situations and unfamiliar places doing unfamiliar activities or around unfamiliar people because of experienced discrimination. I remember one time I was out doing some falconry stuff in Missouri, and people were laughing at me because I was wearing white sneakers. And they were like, "You're going to get those white sneakers dirty. You're going to get them creased. The city boy doesn't know anything about the country life." And, people talked about that in the Facebook world, um, in the falconry Facebook world community. And those who experience that discrimination sometimes develop negative associations and stigma for the outdoors. For someone, the woods and more remote natural areas are associated with violent hate crimes and were historically committed against people of color, particularly African Americans. Participants also express feeling of otherness. A general lack of diversity among recreationists was believed to make non-white members feel different as though they don't belong. And according to participants in this survey, non-white groups may be concerned that others will perceive them as outsiders, as threatening, or possibly treat them differently or discriminate against them. We also have language barriers. Some participants felt the lack of communication in languages other than English contributes to feelings of not belonging in public lands. Demographic data indicated that the majority of individuals in the United States with limited English proficiency live in urban areas. However, the participants in these urban areas pointed out that a lot of the programming was English only, or a lot of the printed material, the signage, the flyers are English only. There's also transportation barriers that people may experience. People feel like a car is needed to get them to their recreation spot. Nearby public transportation options were either non-existent or not convenient because of schedules, bus locations, stop locations, and length of trip. Participants also indicated that there is a certain cost to outdoor recreation and outdoor activities and programs that can prohibit people from participating or maintaining participation over time. Even with basic items such as proper clothing, shoes, sunscreen can be cost prohibitive. Then there are other activities that can require additional gear, equipment, and special permits and licensures. Fees to enter certain parks and natural areas were also discussed as a barrier because residents may be unable or unwilling to pay. I'm assuming a lot of you in this space are birders or are friends with birders, and just look at your equipment. I have thousands of dollars in binoculars. Folks have spent tens of thousands of dollars on cameras, on lenses. That's not accessible for a lot of folks. Then we also start thinking about time itself. Lack of time overlapped with a lot of the topics in terms of financial barriers, and were discussed particularly for low-income households where both parents, a single parent, might be working many hours to make ends meet. Sometimes they have to work several jobs to make ends meet. In these cases, children may not have that adult supervision or the means of getting them to those natural areas. Um, we also have lack of school time and resources. So, specifically around state education and standards and mandates for standardized testing. These mandates impose limits on covered subject matter and the amount of class time a teacher can spend on activities like field trips. Also thinking about participants. Also discussed how teachers, like the parents, may be uncomfortable in the outdoors, and this may keep them from taking their students to green spaces. If I don't feel comfortable in the outdoors, what makes you think that I'm going to be comfortable when I have to be responsible for 20 to 30 students? Um, and then we're also thinking about, how are we going to get all these students on a bus? Sometimes transportation for that many people can be extremely high. So then, this graphic does a phenomenal job of showing how, on the bottom, systemic biases like racism, classism carry over, and that many urban areas are still facing today. We have residential segregation, gentrification, resource allocation, political representation, and how that eventually slowly starts building up even more. And it starts impacting how our cities are made up, how our towns are made up, where there's green spaces, where there's trees planted, where trees aren't planted, where we dump our waste, where we dump waste into the water, landfills. So now we have environmental pollutants, air quality, water quality, soil quality. We also have resource distribution. I know I saw some folks from St. Louis. If you go to North St. Louis, good luck trying to find a grocery store. They're impossible to find. Um, we're also talking about disease dynamics, and all that is not only affecting us humans, but is also affecting the wildlife that we surround ourselves. So because of this point, environmental and social justice go together hand in hand. And unfortunately, what we're seeing nowadays in the last couple of years is just organizations trying to address environmental issues without addressing or even acknowledging the social justice aspect of things. And by addressing both environmental and social issues and engaging diverse audiences in the outdoors, we start building this puzzle piece of just connecting people to people, and realizing that there's a sense of community where we live. And we start building that sense of community, we actually start connecting people to a place and giving them that sense of place that I was talking about earlier. And then when people start getting that sense of place, they really start caring about where they live, and what is around them. The pollutants, the green spaces, the urban heat islands. We start developing these skills to understand. So then we start connecting people to the process of going outdoors by themselves and safely and enjoyably. And then they start realizing that nature is not that accessible for me. So what's the next step? It's policy. So not only are we connecting the people to the people to the place, the people to the process, but now we're connecting people to policy. And this is where, people start understanding how their votes really matter, no matter how big or small, the ballot is. It's really important for those to understand how these policies, whether it's local or federal, really start affecting the outdoors. And, for well over a decade, the US Census Bureau and many other organizations have been reporting that around in 10, 15 years, halfway through this century, the minority in the United States will be the majority. And I think that would freak out a lot of people nowadays, maybe for potentially racist reasons. But, folks like me, I'm freaking out because outdoor recreation and conservation have been dominated by white people since the late 1800s. If people of color and other historically marginalized groups are going to be the majority in this country, but we don't feel connected to nature or feel like we even belong in nature, What's going to happen to our ways of doing conservation in this country? What's going to happen to the ways that we fund conservation in this country? If we think things are bad now, imagine when there's a group of people that just don't care because they don't have that connection um, that some of us have built throughout our lifetimes. So I also want to take another pause here. It looks like we're doing pretty good on time. Um, so I can answer any questions. And then I also have a little activity that I would like to share with you all. So you can take some of this stuff home and work on it yourselves or work on it with friends and families or people in your communities. Um, so I don't know how we want to do questions. If someone wants to read them all.
Sebastian,
Yeah.
it looks like we have one question in the Q&A, and it's a big one. Um,
Cool.
and it is, what can white people do to help make nature feel more inclusive for others? How can we help make it more accessible and comfortable?
Awesome. You know what? I think I'm just going to keep moving on because I think the next section might actually help answer some of those questions, if that's okay.
Let's table it.
Awesome. All right. And if it doesn't answer it, we can come back to it and see if I can take another stab at it. But before we support others and, try to build these spaces, we really should look in the mirror and better understand ourselves. So I recently read this book, The Intersectional Environmentalist: How to Dismantle Systems of Oppression to Protect People and Planet by Leah Thomas. In her book, Leah has a section called Unpacking Privilege. For me, I know privilege can be a bit of a triggering word, so I like to use the word power in lieu of privilege. So privilege can be viewed as power, and power comes in many forms. For example, while I may be a person of color, I am a straight male. So how I engage with the outdoor spaces varies differently from how a woman could. I don't mind walking alone by myself. In fact, I enjoy walking alone by myself in forest and secluded areas. It's just peaceful. And I'm sure many women in this space right now would strongly disagree with me and not be able to relate to this statement. And that's because women may have a very different relationship with being alone in a space than a man would. So while I do have marginalizations, I also have privileges and powers. And the same can be said about everyone else in any given space. So I wanted to share with you some of the questions Leah asked in her book. And I don't think we have enough time to discuss it and unpack it, especially in such a large group. But I strongly encourage folks to make a note of these questions, write them down, maybe answer them as we're going. And if you really feel empowered and comfortable, I strongly recommend you bring these questions to other spaces because, these questions I ask myself time and time again because my answers are always changing. And it's important that we keep asking ourselves these questions. So the first question I like to ask you all to ask yourselves and ask anyone else around you is which aspects of my identity, if any, felt most impactful in your upbringing? And this could be any identity. This could be race, this could be ethnicity, this could be religion, spirituality, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, geographic location. It really could mean anything. Just like, how do you show up in these spaces? And what do you bring that really means a lot? Also, which aspects of my identity were less impactful in my upbringing and why? Are there any aspects that you haven't considered previously that may have influenced the way you perceive the world? Another one, how do my overlapping identities intersect? Many of our identities, like this book, are intersectional. How are those entities showing up in the spaces you hold? And maybe how are some of those identities not showing up in some of these same spaces? Which identity aspects does the world around me use as identifiers before getting to know me? A really good example of this, if you don't quite understand this question like I did when I first read it, is I had a friend who, when he would introduce me to people, new people, I was known as the Colombian guy. And, my friend was not wrong. I am Colombian. I'm very proud of being Colombian. In fact, that's how I started today's conversation, is talking about Colombia. But at the same time, what does a Colombian look like? We come in a lot of shapes. sizes, and skin tones. It's pretty hard to ID a person on a nationality at face value, quite literally. Also, why am I not known as the bird guy, the comic book guy, the guy that likes to garden, the guy that can randomly quote Lord of the Rings at any given moment? So, like, these are other aspects of my identity that people were not seeing before getting to know me. You know, we also have which identity aspects would require a conversation for someone else to learn about me. This kind of goes hand in hand with that previous question. You know, probably I wasn't known as the bird guy or the comic book guy because people didn't know that I liked birds or I didn't like comic books. So, maybe if I would have had those conversations early on, I would have been introduced as Sebastian, the comic book guy, rather than Sebastian, the Colombian guy. Lastly, are there any parts of my identity that I like to explore more? If so, how can I begin that journey? We live in a society where we love to put people in categories. We just love to bin them. It helps provide a sense of belonging and it helps create a sense of being a part of a community. Growing up my entire life, I've always identified as a brown Latino. So imagine my surprise the first time I filled the census and learned that neither brown nor Latino are actually races. So when it asked me what race I am, I had a huge identity crisis. It shattered everything that I knew about myself, and it led me to a massive rabbit hole to really understand who I am in terms of race. And again, these are not light questions. So while you are reflecting, please practice mindfulness with yourself and those that you bring into this space, because these can be some pretty heavy hitting questions. Um, and now, after we think about ourselves and how we move in these spaces, how we show up in these spaces, how we don't show up in these spaces, we can then start thinking about how do we use that privilege or that power to create an inclusive outdoors. So again, these next set of questions are for after you unpacked and learned a little bit about yourselves and how you show up in these spaces. These may be questions you've already asked yourself and your community, and they may be something that this is something you've been wanting to do and you don't really quite sure where to start. So like regardless where you are in this journey of inclusivity, I think it's really important to always ask yourself these questions. Again, these are questions that I constantly ask myself. So the first one is, where do I hear and see bias in my community? And what can I do to disrupt these narratives or norms? For example, you can support organizations that support historically marginalized groups to participate in spaces that have maybe traditionally excluded them. And again, support comes in very different ways. You can show up physically, you can provide gear, you can provide money. Whatever you're capable of, that's a good way for you to show up and start disrupting those norms. How is my relationship different? How is my relationship with the outdoors different from others? Earlier we talked about that cultural competence. How do we navigate the outdoor spaces differently from others? So Drew Langham wrote a satirical piece maybe 10-ish years ago now. It's called 9 Rules for Black Bird Watchers. And even though this piece is strictly satire, there is a little bit of truth behind all this satire. So personally, when I go out birding, I actually take a few extra safety precautions that maybe my white peers may not even think of when it comes to going out and going birding. So first thing I do is I always make sure that I wear clothes that affiliate me to a university. Or sometimes even when I'm working in urban areas, I put on a yellow safety vest because I have been confused for a city employee. You would be surprised how a person's demeanor changes when they think I'm a local, state employee or even just a meter maid. I've had people come in and be like, "Are you here to inspect these potholes?" And I'm like, "Nope, I'm just a birder." And they're like, "Oh, birds, really cool." I also carry multiple forms of identification, especially if I'm affiliated with the university. I always try to carry something that shows that I am a grad student. And I also, as an urban birder, I also make sure that I don't stop in front of homes when I have to use binoculars, because I've done that in the past and I have been accused of staking out a house in the middle of day. Someone came out and they're like, "Are you trying to rob my house?" I was like, "Yes." You got me. I'm the worst criminal you've ever seen. I'm trying to rob you at 10 in the morning in the middle of the street. Um, we also have, what powers do you have that historically excluded people can use? So like I said, power comes in different forms, whether it's your job title, your age, financial standing, whatever. There's a level of power that we all have in any space that we show up. So, where can I use this power to elevate the voices of historically marginalized members of, communities? So before I move on to the next question, I really want to lean in on, this does not mean speak on the individual's behalf. That is a whole different story and a big no-no. This process also means decentering yourself from the conversation and passing the microphone to someone else. You can be an amplifier. You should not be the spokesperson. What language am I using in these spaces? Are we using language that is friendly and welcoming? In the bird community, there is a lot of abbreviations, as I'm sure they exist in other spaces. As birders, we develop a niche language that people pick up, and it just becomes a norm. There's a lot of shorthand in birding, using bird codes for abbreviation or using shorthand for a group of birds. For example, we call birds and we call sparrows and birds that look like, sparrows, LBBs, little brown bird. So imagine if you're having a conversation with your birder friends and, here someone is trying to flip through pages of their, bird ID book because this is the second time they've been birding, and they hear, man, if you go to this spot, you're going to see a bunch of LBBs, and the person is like, oh wow, LBBs, and they're just like looking through their book and they're like, what the heck is an LBB? So it can be incredibly overwhelming and intimidating to people who have never heard this type of language. So remember, there's a lot of words that we take for granted that may not be in someone's lexicon. How can I make, if you're here representing an organization or a community, how do I make my organization more accessible? Are there other community spaces, organizations that I can partner up with to provide resources for the community? Something that we do a lot in Latino Outdoors is we have a lot of organizations that come up to us and like, hey, we are an outdoor organization group that we have a bunch of equipment that to get people outdoors, we reduce the cost, it's great, but a lot of our participants are white. What can we do? And it's like, well, we have what you're looking for and you have what we need, which is money, equipment. So how about we partner up, we create a joint event, and through our both efforts, you get the people that you're looking for, our people get the outdoor experience that they're looking for free or an incredibly reduced cost. Community centers and public libraries are cornerstones in many communities. As birders, we can create birding backpacks with old binoculars that you're not using anymore, an old bird ID book, some sunscreen, things that people can use and check out of the library, to make birding more accessible. Also thinking about what organizations can I develop an authentic relationship with? What are organizations in your area that you can partner up with and collaborate on an event, or provide resources for them to do their own event? You remember, you don't always have to be a part of these spaces physically to support. And also, how do we keep this going year round? Don't show up during Black History Month. Don't show up during, Latinx Heritage Month. Show up year round, because that's going to go a long way. And that's how you become an ally. When you're there year round, you go on this short list for these people and you're like, you know what? I'm thinking of this one person who is just phenomenal. They always have binoculars. They're always there to do whatever. They lead outings for us for free. They've traveled all through South America. They have really bad Spanish, but you know what? They're trying and it's Spanish. Let's give them a call and invite them to our next outing. So like that's how you develop these relationships. So, with that, I wanted to thank you all again for being a part of this space, and again for our hosts for creating a platform to let me talk about my work and what I'm really passionate about. And I wanted to leave you all with a quote by the phenomenal Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer that says, "Knowing that you love the earth changes you. It activates you to defend and protect and celebrate. But when you feel that the earth loves you in return, that feeling transforms a relationship from a one-way street to a sacred bond." So now I'm really happy to go back and revisit any questions that someone may have, or I can also put those questions back if people need a little bit more time to do a screen grab or write them down. But yeah, again, thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer any additional questions folks may have.
Thank you, Sebastian. That was just great. Especially with all of the things that are going on in our country right now. I think that that was incredibly uplifting and important, and thank you a lot for being here. I'm gonna invite the person who um put the question in the Q&A, and I mean, I feel like Sebastian answered it, but like if you want, if you want to ask it again or clarify more, please, throw it in that Q&A. We do have another question as well, Sebastian. Someone says, it can be embarrassingly difficult to imagine ways that I, as a white person, can have an impact. Is thinking small, like asking nature centers and state parks if signs could include languages other than English, a good place to start? Or do we really need to think bigger, or both?
That's a really good question. Personally, I have a hard time thinking bigger because it can be daunting, and it can freeze me. So instead of making any action, I make no actions at all. So I definitely think starting small and bite size is the best way to go. You don't have to change society tomorrow. That would be great if you could, but we have to be realistic and know that that's impossible. So, start really small. Go to the library, be like, hey, do you all have a gear program where we can donate gear? And people can just check it out, whether that's hiking poles, snowshoes, skis, whatever, old binoculars, anything that is used for outdoor recreation that's in good shape. That's a great place to start. If you can volunteer some of your time at a community center and lead some guided tours, that's doing something. If you want to start tackling language barriers, go for it. Once you start building up that momentum, we can build that scale. And again, you don't have to do this alone. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of organizations, a lot of community members that are already doing this work. And once you start doing this work, you're going to start tapping into those folks. And you can start realizing that this is not a weight that you have to carry yourself, which again can be incredibly daunting. I love partnering up with organizations because again, we're all doing the same thing. Why compete with one another? Why don't we pool all our resources and tackle this together? So yeah, definitely start small, work your way up. Once you've built that confidence and you've become you know an an activist, like an active activist, then yeah, start tackling those bigger things for sure. Yeah, you can even make a bird feeder. So there's really no wrong answers. A lot of my participants, they invite their entire neighborhood, or they invite their kids' class to do bird banding events at their house. It becomes like this whole party. The parents bring coffee, donuts, the kids are super excited, they're all taking pictures, it becomes just a giant show and tell. And then Monday morning, when the kids go back to school, they have this crazy story to tell about how this random guy came up to their backyard with a bunch of nets and caught birds and showed it to them, and they show their friends a video of like letting go a bird. That is a transformative moment for our young developing minds. Yeah, I hope that answers it for you. um, Looking at curious, did you do research in St. Louis? And so if you can talk about it, I grew up in the both North and South County areas. Yeah, so I did my research in North City, St. Louis, predominantly in the neighborhoods of Baden and Wells Goodfellow, so the tippy top of North City before you enter North County. I did a lot of work with vacant lots. So, St. Louis has a rich history in racism and segregation. And if you go to North City, it's predominantly Black, impoverished folks. And if you go to South City, it's predominantly white, affluent folks. And with that, you can also see, the history of St. Louis with, racial covenants, white flight, Black flight, and a lot of vacant lots, which for humans can be a blight. But for birds, it's free real estate. So I looked at what sort of habitat these vacant lots were creating and how birds were using that and how vegetation was growing in these vacant lots to provide bird habitat. But then because I was so focused on just ecology, I started talking to a lot of the residents in St. Louis and started hearing a lot of the things that I talked about in this presentation. And I just didn't feel good only answering ecological questions because there's a sociological component to it for sure. Let's see. Excited to check out the book. Awesome. Are there any other books or other resources for additional learning? Yeah. Robin Wall Kimmerer, she's a great author. She has two phenomenal books, Braiding Sweetgrass and Gathering Moss. Something that I actually did is I read Braiding Sweetgrass, and then I read Aldo Leopold's A Sand County Almanac. And you can compare and contrast the two books. These are two very prominent conservationists approaching conservation in very different ways, but also there's a lot of similarity in which they approach conservation. I'm not saying cancel all white people, but there is a lot we can learn when we take different views. So yeah, I would recommend both those books. They're both phenomenal on their own, but if you want to read them together and compare them, go for it. How can I identify the barriers to cooperate? How can I identify the barriers to cooperation when volunteering in underrepresented neighborhoods? That's a really good question. Sometimes it's just taking a seat and listening what these people have to say. When I was doing my research in St. Louis, I actually went to a public forum that was hosted by the Missouri Department of Conservation and local St. Louis agencies, and hearing what I thought was phenomenal work being done by the Missouri Department of Conservation, hearing how the residents of these neighborhoods reacted, really put things into perspective. And you know what? It was probably the most uncomfortable 2 hours that I've ever spent. It just a lot of yelling, a lot of emotions, and I learned a lot in that space. As someone that is not from the Midwest, someone that was not from St. Louis, someone that doesn't know St. Louis like these people do. We have people that have lived here their entire lives, people who started as slaves in St. Louis and built a family and a legacy there. There's a lot of passion. So yeah, sometimes just listening is more than enough to start identifying those barriers. Um, and that goes again with, being there, but also decentering yourself. Um, yeah, you're more than welcome to contact me. I'm happy to plug in my email here. Um, and happy to chat a little bit more about my work and maybe any other folks that should be on your radar. So if we got into a diverse school and helped to make something, birds or whatever, more accessible in theory, are we doing a disservice? Should we convince our more diverse friends to accompany us? How important is it for kids to see myself in the people in front saying, you can do this? Ooh, that's a very good question. Yeah, so like it sounds like you maybe don't want to come across as like a white savior or show up in these spaces that you've never been in or feel like you don't belong and just tell people how to do it. I think that goes back to, yeah, there's nothing wrong with, first and foremost, there's nothing wrong with you showing up into these spaces as an ally, as an individual that's decentering themselves from the conversation, as a person that's using their power and their privileges to, uplift and promote. But that's also a good point. Um, collaborating with organizations, maybe not necessarily, bringing your diverse friends, but, working with people that are already doing this, that, would love to go to these schools, but they are lacking funds, are lacking transportation. The students, again, the students, they run on a tight schedule. They have to make sure that they're hitting those benchmarks in standardized testing. So how are ways that you can work with those teachers maybe, or the school, to fold in this service that you're trying to provide into their curriculum? That's a lot of, you know, red tape. So if you can come up with ways that these things can be incorporated into their curriculum, more power to you. So there's nothing wrong with you showing up in these spaces. Not only is it important for people to see themselves, but it's also important for people to know that they have allies and they have friends that they can trust. My hunting friends, if you look at them at face value, they look like people that I would never associate with. Um, and I look like someone they would never associate with. And it couldn't have been different. I was welcomed. I was taught things. Did I see people around me that looked like me? No, but I saw friends. I saw allies. I saw people that I could go to with questions. I saw people that I can call and be like, I really want to go hunting this weekend. Can you take me somewhere? What's a spot that I can go? And it's like, you know what? I've got a guide. Let me call someone. So yeah, it's both. Do you ever concentrate on nature in urban areas? Nature is not only out there. Yeah, I'm an urban ecologist. I love thinking about ecology from a urban system, an urban dynamic, because not only do we have to think about wildlife, but we also have to think about people. And we also have to think about how people influence that wildlife, that dynamic. So yeah, that's basically all I do. That's why I'm getting my PhD. I work in backyard birds, because a lot of urban areas are private land, and there's very limited public land. So when we do research, we really have to engage the public, so they can literally open the doors to their homes. So I can go to the backyard, catch some birds, do my study. Yeah. And with the few minutes we have left, I'm going to switch slides here so people can see this other stuff. I should have done this a little bit sooner. Sorry.
You had a lot of good questions to answer. There are also a lot of good comments in the chat. If folks haven't been following the chat, I encourage you to do so. And Sebastian, you have a lot of comments for you in the chat, and what I can do is I'll send it to you later so you can read them at leisure.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm just
And
trying to.
and as usual, we'll compile these resources and send them out to follow up as well.
All right. I'm going to stop sharing my screen if that's okay, folks.
Any closing thoughts, Sebastian?
Yeah. I saw that Joe Birch, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, has his hand raised. I don't know if that's a lingering hand or.
I think it's a lingering hand.
Okay.
I don't know what we can do with that,
Yeah.
but Joe had a couple of like comments and questions for you. And Joe, I think you did have one question about like upcoming episodes, and I gave you ours, but Sebastian also gave his email. So if Sebastian, you are doing any upcoming events at all, like in the virtual space, because I know Joe's in Minnesota, most of us here are in Missouri. I know that we'd all be delighted to hear about them and have you present again, see you present again. So if you have anything coming up, just email me and I will tell others so that they can attend. So.
Yeah. And then thank you. I absolutely will. And then for concluding thoughts, um, keep engaging in these spaces, keep learning. Something that I heard a lot during like 2020 was a lot of white folks saying, I'm still learning, and they use it as an excuse to not being able. We're all still learning. It can be scary. Again, like I have power in my other identities, and I try to show up in these spaces where I don't feel comfortable because I don't really understand the culture. I don't really understand the language. I don't really understand how things are playing out. And I just have to tell myself that's okay because this space is really not intended for me. My job, my responsibility is to show up and just listen. It's to show up and provide, sometimes as simple as just a shoulder. You just ask questions, Um, a lot of folks were saying, diverse friends, that's a great opportunity to have like really uncomfortable conversations with really comfortable people. I can't go up to someone in the street and just be like, hey, you're gay. Why? That's not appropriate. But if I have a really good best like friend that's, queer, that creates a space for me to maybe ask a little bit more intimate questions. I've had conversations with friends. It's like, hey, as a person of color, how does this make you feel? What are your thoughts on this? This is what I was thinking. This is what I wanted to do. But these people again are a slice of the pie. They're not going to have all the answers. You also have to do a little bit of lifting on your own, a little bit of reading, a little bit of going out on a limb and attending spaces like this where someone is going to talk to you and they're going to give you maybe a different perspective, and then you can bring that back to your friends like, hey, I was listening to this guy talk. He said XYZ, made me really think a different way. I didn't know this was a way that you felt. I didn't know this was a way that you thought. I would love to explore this a little bit more. There's so much information out there, as well as so much disinformation. So really just do a lot of reading, do a lot of listening. It's probably the best way.
Well, thank you, our friend. I mean, these comments in here really showing a different perspective. You really got to the kind of the spirit of this learning series and really brought it home. That's going to keep perpetuating that too. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Everyone, this presentation by Sebastian will be up on YouTube in just a few days, and please feel free to share it widely. I mean, clearly from the comments in the chat, everyone finds to be an incredibly important message, incredibly well delivered. And so spread it around, please. Thank you, Sebastian.
Thank you. You all have a great
All right. Hope to work with you soon.
likewise.